Okay. Hi, my name is Amy Bach. I am the executive director of the nonprofit insurance consumer group United Policyholders, and I am here today with one of our expert volunteers and sponsors, Minnesota attorney Alex Jadin. And we're going to be catching up today on roof damage and insurance claims in the state of Minnesota, which I have come to understand is a state that has a lot of disasters. Okay, that's me. I've been a professional insurance consumer advocate since the 80s. I co-founded the organization, and I have made it my life's work to inform and educate insurance consumers and advocate for their interests. So on roof damage claims, these are some of the hot spots that property owners encounter when their roof has been damaged in an event. Is the cost of repairing or replacing fully or only partially covered? Alex will be talking about that. Applicable deductibles. Does the damage exceed the deductible? Is the insurance company going to pay benefits? Agreeing on the cost of the repairs. Is the insurer trying to throw out a computer generated lowball estimate that the homeowner that's not realistic for what the homeowner is going to actually have to pay? And then RCV and ACV, which Alex will explain. General claim problems, delays, you can't get an adjuster on the phone, lowballing, the insurer is offering less than the policyholder feels they're entitled to. And then one of the stickiest wickets these days is the fine print in your policy. And you may have some fine print in there that didn't used to be in there. Things like cosmetic damage limitations and the insurer saying they don't pay to restore your property to a matching appearance. All the roof tiles look the same, or all the siding looks the same, or all the carpeting looks the same. It's a big point, a hot spot for a lot of people. And then do you have coverage for upgrading your property to comply with local building codes and ordinances that were put into place after your home was built or after you bought it? So Alex, welcome. If you want to just give a quick introduction to how did you become a property insurance expert?
Well, we founded our firm about 10 years ago. Prior to that, I did a lot of fire litigation and construction litigation. But about 10 years ago, we founded our firm, and I do almost exclusively first party insurance disputes in Minnesota and around the Midwest. There aren't a lot of firms that do this. There are a lot more on the defense side. It's a higher volume business. There just seems to be more people gravitating to that. And we found that there was a gap in people that had knowledgeable representation of the policyholders. So we've been doing that for a little over 10 years and, thousands of claims, and we try to help out anybody who we can.
Well, we really appreciate your time and expertise today because your firm has a very good reputation for knowing what you're doing, knowing what you're talking about. And as a consumer group, of course, it's very important to us that consumers be able to find people like you who actually, you don't just do car accident cases. You actually know how to go to the mat with an insurance company if you need to, because it's not always easy. In fact, I don't think it's ever easy, right?
No.
To do battle if an insurance company feels like they're digging in their heels and there's a lot of money at issue. So talk to us a little bit about what we see on this slide. What does Minnesota law require? Do they have does your home insurance policy have to cover hail and wind or not in Minnesota?
It's going to cover hail and wind. The question of what it has to cover, the biggest issue probably is whether it has to cover it on a replacement cost value or an actual cash value. And in Minnesota, if you have a mortgage on your home or your business, you're going to require the mortgage is actually going to be the mechanism that requires that replacement cost coverage. As a matter of law, you can have an actual cash value policy, but it's, the vast majority of residences are going to have that mortgage, and it's going to require that replacement cost coverage.
Okay. And so ACV, old price, used price, Craigslist price, what a willing buyer would have paid a willing seller before the loss, versus what it's actually going to cost to replace. Is that pretty much a fair definition, or do you, of ACV versus RCV?
Yeah,
Old.
I like to think of it from backwards. So replacement cost is what it costs to fix what's there. The actual cash value is its value in its current condition, taking into account its age, its wear and tear, the fact that it probably has wind and hail damage on it now. So that is going to be your difference, and that difference between it is called the recoverable depreciation. And under a policy in Minnesota and elsewhere, what a carrier is going to do is pay you that actual cash value, and then pay you that recoverable depreciation once you make the repairs on your property.
Right. Okay. And so I take it that it really it somewhat matters what kind of roof you have, right? We're going to talk a little bit about flat versus the issues that flat roofs have. But generally speaking, rain, hail, snow, falling tree branch should be covered, except for these nuances that we're talking about, right?
Sure.
Okay, so we talked about RCV versus ACV. How do building codes upgrades come into play for your clients who've had their property damaged?
Well, in the lion's share of our policyholders, they're going to have coverage for ordinance and law or code upgrades. There are going to be exceptions, and a good caveat for this is the actual language of every individual policy is going to be what's controlling. But if we're talking the median and the average thing we see, these policies cover it. Where we're seeing issues is on some of the developed case law in Minnesota, and that's parsing out what is part of the code coverage and what isn't. Minnesota law does not expressly say, you have to cover every single code issue. It has to be related to the loss. There was a Supreme Court case over the last 6 months in Minnesota that started separating out the component parts of the code coverage. Bad case. We at UPC and in our office wrote some briefs for that particular case. One caveat, and today we're talking about roofs. So one at least less negative thing of that case is there's some language in that decision that say roofs are still going to be enforced on this code compliance. That case had to do with some drywall on a CMU brick wall. So, but what we're really talking about for what people really care about is, imagine a world in which you've got asphalt, 3-tab shingles on your roof, and they're damaged by hail. There's really no dispute. So to fix that, we take them off and we're going to replace them with new shingles. Well, the shingles are nailed into wood beneath it, the sheeting or the decking, is what we call it. This scenario arises when there's issues with the decking, and what do? There's obvious damage to the shingles, but we can't replace them without fixing the decking. That's a code issue that we want the policy to pay for, to give it a nailable surface to actually make the repairs that were damaged by that wind or hail. And that's really the crux of this ordinance and law coverage and this fight. Now, again, imagine you've got maybe a $10,000 insurance claim that can easily turn into a $30,000 claim. There are so many of the policyholders we represent that can't cover that gap on their own. And that's where it takes advocating on your behalf, having vendors and representatives to be able to advocate on your behalf to get that coverage that you were expecting when you bought these policies to cover your homes.
Yeah. Yeah. Okay. So because Minnesota state law doesn't prevent insurers currently from putting these nitpicky, they don't, when I call them nitpicky, it makes it sound like they're small. They're not. They can be big dollar gaps, right? In protection. So you're seeing more cosmetic damage exclusions now, would you say? People have and so does that mean that some Minnesota homeowners are now having to either accept less than restoring their property to its pre-loss condition or fight? Is that kind of how it's coming down?
Sure. And I guess you could say that the change over the last 4 to 5 years in policies, there are roofs that are self-insured now in the state of Minnesota and elsewhere around the country.
Meaning uninsured.
Meaning uninsured.
Right.
Financially uninsured would be a good way to say that.
Right.
When we're talking about issues there, and it's important to say that in Minnesota, and there are other states, this is true, but understanding how you accept coverage in Minnesota. Many people have had the same policy for years or decades. It's always been my care, they've been taking care of me.
Yep.
The way the law works in Minnesota is that every year, if they put a change in your policy, it's your job to read it. It's your job to understand it, or it's your job to find people that can help explain it to you. Because if you pay that premium for that policy, you've accepted the coverage in there.
Yep.
So if you've had the same $5,000 deductible for 5 years and now it's a percentage-based deductible, you've accepted that change
Even
or
though
matching
you
exclusion.
didn't realize it, right? And
You did
a
you
lot of
didn't
the time,
realize it, but the way the law works is
too
you're
bad.
deemed to have understood it by making the payment on it, which most people don't read their insurance policies. Let's be fair.
Right.
So the trick is you're not going to get a good argument on changing the language on it. What you have to do is to be able to argue and advocate around these changes, right?
Yeah.
Um,
Yes.
when there's a policy that talks about cosmetic exclusions,
Hmm.
there's no black and white definition on what cosmetic damage is, right? When we talk about undamaged property as one of the exclusions on there, what is the undamaged property? There are things that the professionals in the space can argue for you. And a lot of it, again, I have to concede, is dependent on the specific policy language. There's no
Yep.
singular answer because each policy can be written better or worse than the last.
Right. So ambiguity is the policyholder's friend in a way, because
Yes.
we can argue, we United Policyholders does all kinds of work to educate people, but it's hard because it's, even if you did read your policy, it's written in, lawyerese, and I've seen even judges struggle, to understand policies. So we, encourage people to take really good notes when they're buying their coverage. And if the agent or the salesperson says, yeah, you got good coverage, you write that down, because the fine print can be very hard to discern. Are there some clients that come to you that only have depreciated value coverage on their roof, and they couldn't even have gotten better coverage? Or is it for most people, if they shopped hard enough, they could have gotten it? Are there some types of roofs that you just cannot get replacement value on because of the age?
Very, very rare exceptions. And it's less because of that mortgage requirement for RCV on a residential policy. It's more that the repairs have to get made before that coverage would be bound. But
Okay.
the average homeowner, unless they don't have a mortgage on theirs, we're going to see an RCV policy on there. It may have limitations and these exclusions.
Mhm.
In the ACV only policy in my space, that's usually going to be some commercial building or a farm building that is intentional. It's not going to be a residence.
Okay. All right. So, what does an insurer owe for damage to a roof under Minnesota law, just generally speaking?
Well, I mean, as you've got on the slide here, it's going to be the cost of repairing or replacing the materials on the roof. It's going to have to be compliant with the building code, and it's going to have to be in a timely manner. Now, that's what they're on paper required to do. It's not necessarily what happens in the real world. The insurance companies are savvy businesses, and they have a lot of smart people advocating for them. And as you mentioned, ambiguity is our friend, but you have to know where to fight. Many policyholders don't know that they have rights.
Yeah.
They don't know how to enforce or to affect those rights. And I think that's where a lot of people lose out on this coverage that they're supposed to be getting, is because they don't know who and how to talk about that coverage to get it.
Yeah, yep. And that's really, why we're here, why we do this series, and why we have on our website, a Minnesota State Help Library. But your firm, of course, is a very important resource in Minnesota, because you have this specialty. So how does Minnesota law define replacement cost?
Well, again, it's going to be the cost to repair or replace without depreciation. Now, what that means, though, is still there's a requirement to perform the work. The rare exception of that is in Minnesota, we have a valued policy, so that if you have a total loss, they're going to pay the policy limits regardless of doing the repairs. You're going to find that in a fire loss. It'd be very rare to see it in a wind and hail type of claim. But yeah, what that means is that they're going to pay for the value today's value of the property, and they're going to pay you the rest of that once you make those repairs. That's kind of a standard policy, clause.
So it's kind of the float, I guess, is like if you can, you're gonna get, if you have a replacement coverage, you're gonna get the full replacement, but you have to often spend it first to get it back. Is that a fair?
Absolutely.
Okay,
Yeah.
which is hard for a lot of people. So we
Yep.
talked about some potential sources where there's some conflict. You talked about the ordinance and law. What about collapse? This is the weight of snow, ice on a roof, the weight of water. Let's say, you've got a property where you think um that there's gonna be a problem, but it hasn't collapsed yet, let's say. Will your insurer pay for that?
If it hasn't collapsed yet, probably not, because now we're talking in maintenance and the wear and tear. So if you have a commercial property, typically like an apartment or any flat roof, make sure the scupper drains are cleared, make sure you're getting the weight of the snow off there, make sure you're maintaining the property. But the typical collapse coverage doesn't get incurred until there's an actual collapse. Some policies say it's a complete and total collapse of the roof. Some allow for a partial collapse. That's going to be policy specific.
Okay.
And those are usually additional coverages in the policy.
Okay.
An average insurance policy in Minnesota will tell you we exclude collapse. So a lot of people don't know to keep looking.
Huh.
But in the insurance policy, there's additional coverages. You got to keep looking in there. Collapse fits into that category, much
Ah,
like ordinance and law. So you have to keep reading the whole policy. And I'll tell you, Amy, I don't know, around the country, a residential policy in Minnesota can be 45, 50 pages. A lot of the
really?
commercial ones that we see are 200 to 400 pages. And whether you like it or not, you really have to read every word in there.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, of course, on some level, United policyholders, we're DIY, we say, well, you've paid good money for coverage. You shouldn't have to pay, again to get what you already paid for. But the reality is on large dollar losses, it's often very hard to get a full payout without getting professional help. So that's why we're here to talk about that. Okay. What are some of the rider's endorsements that matter, Alex?
Number one, ordinance and law coverage, right? That is to make sure that if you have a loss, your home or your business is being brought up to the current building code. Some examples of that. You have rotted decking for your roofs. You've got an old home that has lead or asbestos in it. You've got a commercial property that isn't compliant with the current energy codes. So you need to add, a couple inches of insulation to the roof system. There can be a lot of different issues that come up. Homes can be 100 years old. You have to contemplate what it costs to fix the home today, not what it originally cost. The collapse coverage, I think, is probably, honestly, is a more relevant in the commercial space. Obviously, you
Okay.
see less collapses on a sloped roof, which is a typical home roof, versus
Right.
those flat roofs. They're able to hold more. The
Okay.
replacement cost coverage is an easy, a no-brainer. And then the other two that I really tell people to focus on, specifically homeowners, is to understand whether or not they have any cosmetic or marring exclusions. Those used to just be the metals on roofs, but more and more carriers are including the field of the roof, so the actual shingled portion of the roof
Oh,
or the tile or the metal, as opposed to just the valleys and the vents. And the other one is what is your matching coverage? Minnesota is a matching state. We have a Supreme Court case that provides for reasonably matching materials. Now, a carrier will write in an exclusion to that. You don't want that. So you want to understand what is your coverage. I've got a litany of photos I've used in presentations of what it looks like when you have, say, the siding on the back of your home and there's four pieces that are completely different. It looks ridiculous.
yeah.
So understanding that those are the kind of um, the major coverages you want to understand. And in the commercial space, understanding your deductibles. The
Right.
homeowners is a little more straightforward, but particularly in the commercial space, the community associations like your homeowners associations, your townhomes, your commercial, understanding what your wind and hail percentage of deductibles could be and understanding how you're insuring and how you're self-insuring around those. There's a lot of options, but
Yep.
understanding and having a plan in advance can save you a lot of trouble. Once the loss happens, the policy and the information you have in
Yeah.
place is what controls.
Right.
So being
Right.
prepared helps.
Yeah. 100%. So post loss, these are kind of the fundamentals, taking pictures and documenting damage before anything gets changed or moved or fixed, mitigating, doing everything you can to prevent further damage, contacting your insurance company. And then on the
Yeah.
claim handling side, be realistic about the dynamic between you and the insurance company. They're not your friend. They're not, they're not a social worker. It's a
Yeah.
business dynamic, right? Think of it as a business claim. Um,
Absolutely.
And then some of these are sort of lawyer terminology, concurrent causation, ensuing loss. Appraisal, that's like a mini, dispute resolution process for deciding whether the homeowner's estimate or the property owner's estimate
Yep.
is accurate versus what the insurer is estimating. Alex, how often do you have to take clients to appraisal on property claims?
So we practice all around the country, and I will say of all the states, Minnesota is probably the one we use appraisal the most.
Okay.
The laws in it are very straightforward, and it gives the policyholder sort of a quick, speedy, and inexpensive. That's actually a quote from a case. A plain, speedy, and inexpensive resolution to a claim.
Yep.
And for me, as the lawyer, I love the idea of a dispute getting resolved at the property by 3 experts.
Yep.
Rather than a jury of 6 to 12 people who are just looking at photos and may not know what's going on.
Right.
So in Minnesota in particular, the appraisal process is used to resolve the lion's share of disputed insurance claims in Minnesota.
Okay, very good. All right, so we have talked about the riders and endorsements that matter most when it comes to coverage for damage to a roof, having replacement value, not having having a cosmetic exclusion, but understanding that it's limited.
Yeah.
And then having code upgrade coverage, best practices related to your roof's condition. You heard Alex talk about how important it is to do routine maintenance, keep your gutters clear, and try to check on it, on a regular basis. Is there a minimum amount in dispute on a roof damage claim that makes it worth hiring a lawyer?
Yeah, and what number that is going to vary depending on who you work with and what your issues are. Whether we like it or not, you touched on this. This is about a business.
Yep.
I like to tell clients to go, insurance companies, they're amoral. They're not out to get you. It's a business, though. I mean, it's a game of math. And if it's going to cost you more money to get something than what you can get, it doesn't make any sense.
Right.
So, as a firm, we're very big on the economic realities of what disputes are. But for anybody in Minnesota or in the Midwest who would have a question, any good lawyer is going to give you a free consultation on does it make sense or not. So like a good lawyer answer, I mean, it depends, but it really is on a case-by-case basis what makes sense and what doesn't.
Okay. And is it possible to hire an attorney for an insurance matter in Minnesota on a contingent fee basis, or do you always have to pay by the hour?
Nope, you can do either. As a firm, we probably do more contingent than we do hourly. I like to say there's a time and place for everything. So it's what makes sense for that policyholder in that situation. But either one of those are viable options within Minnesota.
And for me as a consumer advocate, of course, the contingency fee system is so important. It's the keys to the courthouse for people who can't afford to, pay a lawyer by the hour. And these things do add up fast. So paying a lawyer by the hour for an insurance dispute, I often think is really only for very wealthy people and for businesses.
Agreed.
Right. So for the average person, a firm that will work on contingency it makes all the difference in the world. What about expense costs? You typically advance those, or do you ask the clients? Does that depend that the client has to kick in some for costs, or do you guys advance those?
In a typical contingent fee case, we would advance the costs and they would be reimbursed upon recovery. So, sort of the PI statement, if you don't have a recovery, there's no out of pocket.
Right.
So we'd advance those, and if we lose or don't get a recovery, you don't have to pay them back, but they're part of the recovery when the case gets resolved if there is one.
Right. So of course, that's very, very important for the consumer. So this is a snapshot of our Minnesota Help Library landing page on our website, which you can see here. We always encourage people to make their voice heard if they are getting jerked around by an insurance company. The Minnesota Department of Commerce has a consumer service center. You can keep your expectations reasonable. They cannot give you a free lawyer and a free claim adjuster. But if there's something egregious that the insurance company is doing, they will certainly try to help make that right. If you have a problem with a flood insurance policy that you got through the National Flood Program, that would be your remedy would be with FEMA and that program, and or a complaint to your U.S. congressional or Senate representative. On all regular insurance matters. If you're not getting the help that you need from the Department of Commerce and you're having trouble finding a lawyer to help you, then you should get in touch with your state elected representative. And this is the directory link to Alex's firm. I want to say again, Alex, thank you so much for your expertise, and just ask you, is there anything before we wrap up that you would want to add to this catch up on roof damage?
Just, I think the importance of having trusted resources and vendors, whether it be the United policyholders, whether it be a contractor that you trust. Think of like every different part of life. You take people that know what they're doing and you use them as a resource to give you advice. Probably good for me, maybe not good for the consumer, but insurance has gotten more and more complicated every year I've been practicing law. So having people that can advocate on your behalf and can talk to you straight and give you advice, it's worth its weight in gold.
I could not agree with you more. And on that note, we are going to wrap up this catch up. And I wish you well. And thank you again for sharing these practical tips with our audience.
Anytime. Thanks for having me.
Bye-bye.